I was already an old woman when the man I loved began returning to me in envelopes, one by one, as if time had finally decided to correct itself too late to matter. And the first thing I noticed was not the handwriting, not even my own name written in ink I had once traced with my fingers, but the dates, all those years stamped in the corner like quiet witnesses to a life I had already lived without him. The box arrived on a Tuesday morning, just after 9, when the light through my kitchen window falls in that soft, forgiving way that makes everything look almost the way you remember it, and I remember standing there longer than I should have, my hand resting on the lid, because something in me already knew that opening it would not give me back what I had lost, only show me how long it had been missing. I had a life, of course I did. I had a husband once, a good man who deserved more of me than I knew how to give. I had a daughter who grew into someone kind and steady. I had a small house with a porch where I learned how to sit still in the evenings and call that peace. But there was always a space I never filled, not because I refused to, but because I did not know what had been taken from me until much later. The first envelope was thin, worn at the edges, my name written carefully, Eleanor Hayes, as if he had paused before each letter, and when I turned it over I saw the seal had never been broken, and that was when my hands began to tremble, not from age, not entirely, but from the realization that whatever he had tried to say to me had never reached me, not once, not ever. I told myself to sit down before opening it, but I did not listen. I rarely did in those moments that mattered most, and when I finally slid my finger beneath the flap, it felt like crossing into something I had spent decades avoiding without knowing it, and inside was a single sheet of paper, folded with care, the ink slightly faded but still unmistakably his, Vincent Moretti, name I had not spoken out loud in over 40 years, a name that still lived somewhere beneath everything I had built since. I did not read the whole letter at first, I could not, I only saw the first line, and it was enough to take the air from my lungs, because he wrote as if I were still waiting for him, as if time had not passed, as if the world had not moved on without asking either of us for permission, and I realized then that whatever had happened between us had not ended the way I believed it had. It had simply been interrupted, quietly, completely, and for a very long time, and I stood there in my kitchen, holding a letter that had taken decades to find me. And for the first time in years, I understood that the part of my life I thought was over had never really left at all. I did not open the second letter right away, not because I did not want to, but because I needed time to understand what the first one had already changed, and I stood there for a long moment in that same quiet kitchen, the clock ticking in a way I had never noticed before, as if each second was asking me where these years had gone and why they had come back now, and I remember placing the letter down carefully on the table, smoothing it with my hand as though it were something fragile that might disappear if I moved too quickly, and in that moment I realized something I had not allowed myself to think about in decades, which was that I had never truly stopped waiting, not in the way people imagine waiting, not standing by a window or checking the mailbox every day, but in the quieter way, the way that settles into your bones and becomes part of how you live, how you choose, how you hold back without knowing why. I had told myself a story for years, a simple one, the kind that makes life easier to carry, that he had not come back, that the war had taken him like it had taken so many others, that whatever we had shared had been brief and real but finished, and I built everything else on top of that belief, every decision, every compromise, every moment I convinced myself that moving forward was the same as letting go, but standing there with that letter in my hands, I understood that I had built my life on something incomplete, not a lie exactly, but not the truth either, and that realization did not come like a shock, it came slowly, like a door opening in a house you thought you knew by heart. I picked up the letter again and forced myself to read it from the beginning, and his words were careful, measured, not the kind of writing a young man uses when he is trying to impress someone, but the kind that comes from someone who has already seen too much and is choosing each sentence like it matters, and he did not write about the war the way others did. There were no details meant to frighten or impress, only small things, the kind that linger, the way the air felt in the early morning, the sound of boots on gravel, the way he thought about the last time he saw me standing under that station light, and when he wrote my name it was not dramatic, it was quiet, steady, as if saying it kept him anchored somewhere he was afraid to lose. I sat down finally, the chair pulling slightly against the floor, and I read the letter all the way through, and then I read it again, slower, noticing the pauses, the places where the ink pressed harder into the paper, and by the time I reached the end I realized something that made it hard to breathe, which was that he had written this believing I would read it soon after, believing that somewhere, not very far from him, I was living my life in a way that still included him, and I wondered how many more of these there were, How many versions of me he had written to over the years, never knowing that none of them had ever reached the woman who had been waiting in ways she could not name. And I looked back at the box, still full, still unopened, and for the first time since it arrived, I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Not just sadness, not just regret, but a quiet, growing question that would not leave me alone. What if everything I believed about how it ended was wrong? I did not plan to go back to that year, not in the way the memories began to return after I read his words, because for most of my life I had kept those days folded away like something too delicate to handle often. But the letters made it impossible to stay in the present, and before I opened another envelope I found myself sitting there with my hands still, staring past the kitchen window and seeing something else entirely, something much colder, much louder, and yet strangely quieter in the way it lived inside me. And it brought me back to the first time I saw him, not as a grand moment, not as something I understood right away, but as a small shift in an ordinary day that I only recognized years later as the beginning of everything. It was early winter in 1944, and the station was busier than usual, soldiers moving through in waves, the air thick with the sound of announcements and the low hum of people trying not to say too much before goodbye. And I was there in a volunteer uniform that never quite fit the way it should have, carrying supplies, checking lists, doing the kind of work that felt useful without ever feeling like enough. And I remember thinking how young everyone looked, even the ones who tried to stand taller than they felt. And then there was him, not louder, not more noticeable in the way some men try to be, but still in a way that made everything around him seem slightly less certain. Vincent Moretti did not introduce himself right away, and I did not ask, but I noticed him because he did not look at things the way the others did. He watched as if he were measuring the distance between moments, as if he were already somewhere else even while standing right there. And when our eyes met for the first time, it was not sudden or overwhelming, it was steady, like recognition arriving before explanation. And I remember looking away first, not out of shyness exactly, but because there was something in that look that felt like it belonged to a story I had not yet lived. Later that day, when the platform grew crowded and a delay was announced, I found myself standing not far from him again. And this time he spoke, his voice low, careful, asking a simple question about the schedule that I could have answered without thinking, but I remember answering more slowly than I needed to, aware of something I could not name. And when I told him what I knew, he nodded once, thanked me, and did not try to extend the conversation, which somehow made me more aware of him than if he had stayed. It was only later, after I had finished my shift and the crowd had thinned, that I realized he had been watching over more than just the schedule, that he had noticed the way the station changed when certain men moved through it, that he carried himself like someone who understood danger without needing to announce it. And even then I did not think of it as anything important. Not yet, not then, because at that time I still believed that the most significant moments in life would arrive clearly, with some kind of certainty, and I did not understand that sometimes they begin quietly, in the space between one glance and the next, before you have the chance to decide whether you are ready for them or not. It was not the way he spoke that stayed with me, not at first, but the way he seemed to notice things before they happened, and I began to understand that a few days later, when the station grew restless in a way I could not explain, when the air shifted and conversations lowered without anyone saying why, and I found myself moving through my tasks with a quiet unease that had no clear source until I saw him again, standing a few feet away, not looking at me directly but aware of where I was all the same, and there was something in the way he held himself that made me pause, as if he were listening to something I could not hear. I remember dropping a small stack of papers that afternoon, nothing important, just a simple mistake, but it startled me more than it should have. And before I could bend down to gather them, he was already there, picking them up with a calm that felt out of place in that moment, and when he handed them back to me, our fingers brushed for the briefest second, and I felt something shift, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just enough to make me aware that I would remember that moment long after it passed. He did not linger, he never did, but before stepping away he said something quietly, almost as if it were not meant to be heard by anyone else, that I should stay near the main platform until things settled. And I remember wanting to ask what he meant, wanting to understand what he seemed to already know, but I did not, because there was something in his tone that did not invite questions, only trust. The rest of that day moved differently, slower in some places, faster in others, and I found myself following his suggestion without fully realizing I was doing it, staying where the lights were brighter, where there were more people, where things felt more certain, and every now and then I would catch a glimpse of him at the edge of the platform, always positioned in a way that made it seem like he could see everything without being seen himself. I did not understand then what kind of life teaches a man to move like that, to measure spaces, to read people in silence, but I understood enough to feel safe in a way that had nothing to do with words, and that was what unsettled me most, because I had not known him long enough to trust him, and yet I did, without asking for reasons, without needing them. Later, when the station finally quieted and the last train of the evening pulled away, leaving behind that hollow stillness that always followed a crowded day, I saw him again, this time closer, standing under a dim light that made everything look softer than it was. And for a moment neither of us spoke, and in that silence there was something unspoken but clear, that whatever this was, whatever had begun in these small, unnoticed moments, it was already more than either of us had planned for, and I remember thinking, without fully understanding why, that some people enter your life not by chance, but by timing you do not yet have the words to explain. And that night, as I walked home with the cold air pressing gently against my face, I carried the quiet certainty that something had changed, even if I could not yet see what it would become. The days that followed did not feel extraordinary while I was living them, and that is something I have come to understand only much later, because the most important parts of a life rarely announce themselves as they happen. They settle quietly into place, almost unnoticed, and it was like that with him, with Vincent, the way he began to exist at the edges of my days, never demanding attention, never asking for more than what was already there, and yet becoming something I looked for without meaning to. I would notice him before I realized I was searching, a familiar presence near the platform, sometimes leaning slightly against a post, sometimes standing with his hands in his coat pockets as if he had all the time in the world, though there was always something in his eyes that suggested otherwise, something held back, measured, as though he were careful not to take more from a moment than it was willing to give. We spoke more after that, though not in the way people imagine when they think of two people getting closer. There were no long confessions, no grand declarations, just small conversations that seemed to carry more weight than they should have about ordinary things, the kind that become meaningful only because of who you are saying them to. And I remember one afternoon when the station had a brief lull, the kind that feels almost unreal after hours of movement, and we stood side by side watching a train pull in slowly, the metal wheels echoing softly, and he asked me what I planned to do when the war was over, and I told him I wanted to teach something simple, something steady, and he listened in that quiet way of his, not interrupting, not offering advice, just listening as if my answer mattered more than I believed it did. When I asked him the same question, he paused longer than I expected, and for a moment I thought he might not answer at all, but then he said he did not know if he would return to anything that resembled a normal life, and there was no bitterness in his voice, no regret, just a calm acceptance that unsettled me more than any uncertainty would have. And I realized then that whatever his life had been before I met him, it was not something he could easily leave behind even if he wanted to. There were moments when I wanted to ask more, to understand what he meant, to see beyond the careful distance he kept around certain parts of himself, but I never did, not because I was afraid of the answers, but because I sensed that he was giving me exactly what he could, no more, no less, and that asking for more might change something I was not ready to lose. Instead, we remained in that space between knowing and not knowing, where everything feels both fragile and certain at the same time, and I began to realize that what I felt for him was growing, not in a sudden way, but steadily, quietly, like something taking root beneath the surface where no one else could see it. And I did not name it then. I did not say the word out loud even to myself, because I believed there would be time for that later, time to understand it, time to say it, time to decide what it meant. And I did not yet know that sometimes the most important things in life do not wait for us to be ready. They arrive, they settle in, and then they are taken away before we ever learn how to hold on to them properly. The day he told me he was leaving did not begin any differently than the others, and that is the part one remember most clearly, the ordinary way it started, the way I moved through my morning without any sense that something was about to shift in a way I would carry for the rest of my life. And I saw him before he spoke, standing where he usually did, but there was something different in the stillness of him, something heavier, as if he had already stepped slightly away from everything around him. And when our eyes met, I knew before he said a word that this was not a conversation I could change. We walked a short distance away from the main platform, not far enough to disappear, just enough to find a quieter space between the noise, and for a moment neither of us spoke, which was not unusual for us, but this silence felt different, fuller, as if it already contained what was coming. He told me he had orders to leave within the week, His voice steady, almost too steady, and I remember nodding as if I had expected it, as if this was how things always went, and perhaps in some way I had, because nothing about that time allowed for anything permanent, and yet knowing it and hearing it were not the same, and I felt something inside me begin to tighten in a way I could not undo. I asked him where he would be sent, and he gave me an answer that felt like a place but also not, something distant, something undefined, and I understood then that there were parts of his life that would always remain just beyond my reach, not because he wanted to keep them from me, but because they belonged to a world I had never entered. We stood there a little longer, and I remember the sound of a train passing behind us, the low rumble that seemed to fill the space between what we were saying and what we were not, and I wanted to tell him something more than I had ever said before, something that would make this moment stay, but the words did not come the way I needed them to. They stayed just out of reach, and I realized too late that I had been waiting for the right moment to say something that does not wait. Instead, he reached into his coat and handed me a small book, nothing expensive, just something worn enough to feel like it had been carried for a while, and inside the cover he had written his name, Vincent Moretti, and beneath it, a simple line that I did not fully understand then but would remember for years, as if he had known I would need something to hold on to when everything else became uncertain. He told me he would write, not as a promise meant to comfort, but as something he had already decided, and I nodded again, holding the book a little tighter than necessary, as if that might keep him there a moment longer. And when the time came for him to leave, it was not dramatic, there were no long goodbyes, no words that carried everything we had not said, just a look that lasted slightly longer than the others we had shared, and then he stepped away, becoming part of the movement of people and uniforms and departures, and I stood there watching until I could no longer tell where he had gone, and even then I stayed because leaving would have meant accepting that something had already ended before I had understood what it was. The first letter arrived on a morning so ordinary I almost missed it, tucked between a bill and a folded newspaper, the envelope thin and unremarkable except for the way my name was written, carefully, deliberately, as if each letter mattered more than the message itself, and I remember holding it for a moment before opening it, not because I hesitated, but because something in me recognized it before my mind did, something quiet and immediate that made everything else fall away. And when I finally opened it, the world I had just begun to accept without him shifted again, not violently, not suddenly, but in a way that settled deep and refused to leave. His words were simple at first, almost cautious, as if he were unsure how to begin after a goodbye that had said so little, and he wrote about small things, the weather, the rhythm of his days, the way time seemed to stretch and fold in places far from home, but beneath those details there was something else, something steady and constant, the way he returned to me in each line, not with grand declarations, but with quiet observations, as if I were still part of his life in a way neither distance nor silence could erase. I began to wait for those letters without admitting that I was waiting, telling myself it was only habit, only curiosity, only the continuation of something that had not yet found its end, but each time I saw that familiar handwriting, something inside me settled, something that had been uncertain since the day he left, and I would read each letter more than once, first quickly, then slowly, then again later, as if the words might change depending on how I held them. I kept them in the small wooden box beside my bed, the same place where I placed the book he had given me, and over time that box became something more than storage. It became a space where the part of my life that included him continued quietly, untouched by everything else that was moving forward around me. His letters grew deeper as the weeks passed, not in a way that declared anything outright, but in the spaces between what he chose to say, the way he remembered small details about me that I had not thought were worth remembering, the way he described moments as if he were speaking directly to me, not just writing, and I found myself answering him in my head before I ever put pen to paper, carrying on conversations that existed somewhere between the life I was living and the one that might have been. I wrote back, of course, careful at first, unsure of what was allowed, what could be said, what should remain unspoken, but slowly I began to write more. Honestly, not everything, not the words I still could not say out loud, but enough that I felt something growing between us, something real despite the distance, something that did not feel temporary even though everything around us was. And then, just as quietly as it had begun, it changed, not all at once, not in a way that could be clearly marked, but in a shift so subtle I almost convinced myself it was nothing, a letter that took longer to arrive, then another, the rhythm breaking in a way I tried not to notice, telling myself there were reasons, delays, explanations I did not yet understand. But beneath those thoughts there was something else, something I did not want to name. A small, persistent silence beginning to take shape where his words had always been. And even then, before it fully happened, before the waiting became something else entirely, I felt it. The beginning of an absence that would stay with me long after the letters themselves were gone. Then the letters stopped, not with a final word, not with an explanation, not even with the kind of silence that feels intentional, but with a quiet absence that took me longer than it should have to understand. And I remember the day I realized it was not just a delay, not just a gap that would be filled if I waited a little longer, because waiting had already become something I did without thinking, something that shaped my mornings and settled into my evenings. And at first I told myself, there were reasons, that mail moved slowly, that time stretched differently where he was, that everything I did not understand could be explained if I only gave it enough space. But days turned into weeks, and weeks into something heavier, something that no longer felt temporary. I wrote to him again, carefully, as I always had, choosing my words as if they might find him more easily if they were gentle, if they carried something steady and familiar. And I remember walking to the mailbox with a kind of quiet determination, as if sending that letter would restore something that had only been paused. And when I dropped it in, I stood there a moment longer than necessary, watching as if I might see it travel, as if I could follow it all the way to wherever he was. But there was no reply, not the next week, not the one after, and the space between his last letter and the present grew wider in a way I could no longer ignore. And I began to check the mailbox more often than I admitted, sometimes twice in a day, sometimes without reason, telling myself it was habit, but knowing it was hope in a form I could not quite control. People around me began to speak differently about the war, as if it were something that would soon end, as if there were a finish line approaching that would return everything to the way it had been before. And I wanted to believe that, I wanted to think that when it was over, he would come back with everyone else, that the letters had only stopped because something larger had taken his attention, something temporary, something that would pass. But beneath that belief there was a quieter thought I did not allow myself to complete. A question that remained unfinished because I was not ready for its answer. When the war finally did end, there was a kind of celebration in the air, a relief that settled over everything, and people began to return, slowly at first, then in waves, and I stood at the station more often than I needed to, watching faces, searching without admitting that I was searching, and every time a train arrived, I felt something rise in me, something that expected, just for a moment, to see him step down, to see that familiar stillness in a moving crowd. But each time the doors opened and closed again, and he was not there. I waited longer than I told anyone, longer than I told myself, because stopping felt like giving up something I had not yet lost completely. And in that waiting, something changed inside me, not all at once, not in a way I could mark, but slowly, as the absence settled into something more permanent, something that no longer asked for explanation, only acceptance. And even then, even as I began to step into a life that did not include him, I kept a part of myself turned toward that silence, as if it might still answer if I listened long enough. Life did not stop when the letters did, and that was the part one struggled with the most, not the silence itself, but the way everything else continued, as if nothing had been interrupted, as if a person could simply fold a part of their life away and still move forward without consequence. And at first I tried to resist that movement, not openly, not in a way anyone could see, but in the quiet decisions I made, the way I lingered a little longer at the station, the way I kept his last letter closer than the others, as if proximity could somehow change what had already happened. But time does not wait for understanding, and slowly, without asking me if I was ready, it carried me into a different kind of life, one that looked complete from the outside, one that made sense to everyone who saw it. And I learned how to live inside that version of myself the way people learn anything, by repetition, by necessity, by accepting what is offered even when it is not what was once hoped for. I met a man who was kind in the ways that matter, steady, patient, someone who did not ask questions about the parts of me that remained quiet. And I married him not because I had forgotten, but because I believed that remembering did not have to prevent me from building something else. And for a time that belief was enough. It allowed me to step into a life that felt real, that had structure, that gave me a sense of purpose beyond waiting. We built a home together, nothing grand, just something solid, something that held the shape of a life lived day by day. And when our daughter was born, I thought perhaps that would be the moment everything settled into place, that love in one form might soften the absence of another. And in many ways it did. There is A kind of fullness that comes with caring for someone who depends on you, a kind of clarity that reshapes your priorities. And I held on to that, I let it guide me, I let it become the center of my days. But even then, in the quiet moments when the house was still and the world seemed to pause just enough for thoughts to surface, I would find myself returning to that earlier time, not always with intention, sometimes just with a feeling, a memory that moved through me without warning, and I realized that what I had with Vincent had not disappeared. It had simply changed form, becoming something that existed beneath everything else, not interfering, not demanding attention, but never fully gone. I kept the letters I had received, the ones that had made it to me before the silence began. And I kept the book he had given me, tucked away in a place no one else thought to look, not because I was hiding it, but because I did not know how to explain it, how to describe something that had no clear ending, no final moment to point to and say that is where it stopped. Over time I stopped expecting anything to change. I stopped checking the mailbox with the same quiet hope. I stopped looking for his face in places where it would not appear. And I told myself that this was what acceptance looked like, not forgetting but learning how to live alongside what remained, and for many years that was enough, not perfect, not complete, but steady, and I truly believed that whatever had happened between us had found its place in the past, that it would stay there unchanged until the day I no longer thought about it at all. And I did not know then that some stories do not stay where we leave them, that some parts of our lives wait quietly unchanged, until the moment they return and ask us to see them differently. It was not until I opened the fourth letter from the returned box that something began to feel wrong in a way I could not ignore, not because of what he said, but because of what surrounded it, the marks on the envelope, the faint stamps and ink symbols that did not belong to any ordinary delivery, and I remember turning it over slowly in my hands, tracing the edges as if I might recognize something I had missed before. And there it was, a small official marking, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, a sign that the letter had been intercepted, processed, handled by someone other than the person it was meant for. I sat there for a long time before opening it, longer than I had with the others, because this was no longer just about what he had written. It was about everything that had kept those words from reaching me, and when I finally unfolded the paper inside, I found his voice again, steady, familiar, unchanged by the years that had passed for me but not for him, and he wrote as if nothing had broken between us, as if the silence I had lived through had never existed. And that was when the truth began to shift inside me, slowly, carefully, like something rearranging itself into a shape I did not yet understand. He mentioned things I had no memory of receiving, questions he asked that I had never answered, small references to letters I had supposedly sent, and I realized with a quiet, growing certainty that our story had not ended where I believed it had. It had continued without me, carried forward by words that never reached their destination. I went back to the box then, not with hesitation this time, but with urgency, opening each envelope more quickly, scanning for the same markings, the same signs of interruption. And they were there, again and again, different stamps, different dates, all pointing to the same quiet interference, something or someone that had stood between us without ever revealing itself. In one letter, written later than the others, his tone changed slightly, not dramatically, but enough that I could feel the weight of it, and he wrote about trying to leave something behind, something he called his family's work, words that meant little to me at the time but now carried a different meaning, something darker, something that explained the caution I had always sensed in him, the way he moved, the way he watched, the way he never said more than he needed to. I leaned back in my chair then, the letter still open in my hands, and I felt the years between us collapse in a way that was almost unbearable. Because everything I had accepted, everything I had built my understanding on began to shift, not into something entirely new, but into something more complete and far more painful, because it meant that he had not simply disappeared. He had been there, writing, reaching, continuing something I believed had already ended. And I had been here, waiting for a silence that was never meant to be permanent. I thought about all the days I had stood at the mailbox, all the nights I had wondered if I had imagined what we had, and for the first time, I understood that the silence had not been his. It had been placed between us, deliberately, quietly, in a way that left no trace except the absence itself. And I sat there in that still kitchen, surrounded by letters that had taken decades to arrive, realizing that the story I had lived with for most of my life was missing its most important truth, and that somewhere within these pages, there was an answer I had waited for without knowing it, an answer that had always been written, just never delivered. Once I understood that the silence had not been his, I could not return to the life I had been living in quite the same way, not because anything around me had changed, but because something inside me refused to stay where it had been placed for so many years, and I found myself going back through the letters again, this time not as memories, not as pieces of something lost, but as evidence of something that had continued without me, something that had tried to reach me again and again until it was stopped. There was one envelope near the bottom of the box that looked different from the others, not in any obvious way, but in the weight of it, the way it felt slightly thicker, as if it carried more than just words, and I remember holding it longer than the rest, aware that whatever I found inside might change everything I had come to understand over the past few hours. When I opened it, a smaller folded page slipped out along with the letter itself, something that had not been meant for easy reading, something tucked inside as if it were too important to risk being seen, and I unfolded it carefully, my hands slower now, more deliberate. And what I found there was not a continuation of the letters I had come to know, but something more direct, more exposed, as if he had finally written without holding anything back. He spoke of returning after the war, not in the uncertain way he had written before, but as something already done, something already real, and he mentioned places I recognized, streets in New York I had walked countless times, locations that existed within reach of the life I had been living all those years, and I felt a kind of stillness settle over me as I read, because it meant that at some point, he had been here, not far away, not unreachable, but close enough that our lives might have crossed again if something had been different. He wrote about trying to find a way out of what he called his family's world, describing it not with details, but with a clarity that made it impossible to misunderstand, a life that would have pulled me into something I was never meant to be part of. And for the first time I saw his distance not as absence, but as a kind of protection, something chosen rather than imposed. There was a line near the end of that page that I read more than once, not because it was difficult to understand, but because it was so simple I almost missed it, and he wrote that he had come close to seeing me once, that he had stood on the opposite side of a street and watched me walk past without knowing he was there, and that he had turned away before I could notice, not because he did not want to see me, but because he believed that stepping back was the only way to keep my life untouched by his. I set the letter down after that, not because I had finished reading, but because I could not continue without letting what I had just learned settle into something I could carry, and I sat there in that quiet room, realizing that the life I thought we had lost to time had not ended in the way I believed. It had been reshaped by choices I never saw, by decisions made in silence, by a kind of love that did not ask to be recognized, and for the first time since the box arrived, I felt something shift that was not only grief, not only regret, but something deeper, something that asked me not just to remember what had been, but to understand what it had truly meant all along. I did not sleep much that night, not because I was restless in the way people usually mean, but because something inside me had been quietly awakened and would not settle back into the place it had lived for so many years, and by morning I knew that reading the letters was no longer enough, that understanding what had happened required something more than memory, something more than reflection, and I found myself doing something I had not done in decades. I began to look for him not in the past, but in the present. It started simply with names, with records, with small searches that felt almost foolish at first, as if I were chasing something that had already chosen not to be found, and yet each step led to another, each small piece of information unfolding into something slightly clearer, until the name Vincent Moretti no longer belonged only to the quiet man I had known at the station, but to a life that had continued far beyond that moment, a life that had taken shape in ways I could not have imagined at the time. There were mentions, not many, not detailed, but enough to suggest a presence, a figure connected to something larger, something controlled and distant, and I recognized the pattern of it even before I fully understood what it meant, because it matched the silence I had always sensed in him, the careful distance, the things left unsaid. I followed those traces slowly, not with urgency, but with a kind of quiet determination, and eventually they led me to a place I would never have expected, a private care facility on the outskirts of the city, one of those quiet buildings that does not draw attention to itself, where time seems to move differently, where the past and present sit closer together than they do anywhere else. I remember standing outside for a moment before going in, not because I was afraid, but because I understood that whatever I found inside would not give me back what had been lost. It would only bring me closer to the truth of it, and that truth, whatever it was, would have to be enough. The receptionist spoke gently, as if used to people arriving with questions they did not know how to ask, and when I gave his name there was no surprise, only a quiet recognition, and she told me he was there, that he had been there for some time, and that something in her tone made me pause, not because of what she said, but because of what she did not say. I followed her down a long hallway, the kind that softens footsteps, the kind that holds silence in a way that feels almost intentional, and with each step, the years between us seemed to fold in on themselves, not disappearing but narrowing, until they felt like something I could almost cross. When she stopped outside a door and gently pushed it open, I did not move right away, not because I could not, but because I needed a moment to understand that this was no longer a memory, no longer a letter, no longer a version of him preserved in ink and paper. This was real, this was now. And when I finally stepped inside, I saw him, not as he had been, not as I had remembered, but as he was, older, quieter, the weight of time visible in ways that could not be undone. And yet there was something in his face, in the way he turned slightly at the sound of the door, something unmistakable, something unchanged, and in that moment, without a word, without any need for explanation, I knew that after all those years, after all that had been lost and misunderstood, we had found each other again, not in the way we once imagined, not in the way we might have hoped, but in the only way that was left to us. I did not rush toward him, not because I was uncertain, but because something in that moment asked for stillness, for the kind of quiet that allows the truth of a life to settle into place without being forced, and I stepped closer slowly, aware of the sound of my own breath, the faint movement of the room around us, and when his eyes met mine there was no confusion there, no hesitation, only recognition that seemed to move through the years without resistance, as if time had changed. Everything except that. I said his name once softly, Vincent, and it felt both unfamiliar and entirely my own, like a word I had carried for too long without speaking, and he did not answer right away, but I saw something shift in his expression, something that did not need language to be understood, and in that silence, I realized that we had already said everything we needed to say simply by finding each other again. I sat beside him after a moment, the chair close enough that I could see the details I had once known so easily, now altered by time but not erased, and I placed the letters gently on the table between us, not as evidence, not as accusation, but as something returned, something that had finally reached its destination after traveling farther than either of us could have imagined. I told him I had received them, all of them, that I had read his words for the first time only days before, and as I spoke, I understood that what mattered was not how long it had taken, but that it had happened at all, that the connection we had once shared had not been lost, only delayed in a way that neither of us could have prevented. He listened the way he always had, quietly, without interruption, and when he finally spoke, his voice was softer than I remembered but carried the same steadiness, and he said that he had never stopped writing, not once, not even when he believed the letters might never reach me, because for him, writing had been the only way to remain close to something he could not return to, and I felt something inside me settle as he said it, not because it erased what had been lost, but because it confirmed what I had begun to understand, that his absence had not been empty, it had been filled with a kind of presence I had never received. We did not try to reclaim what time had taken, we did not speak of what might have been if things had been different, because there was no need. The years between us were not something to undo, they were something to accept, to recognize as part of the same story that had brought us here, to this quiet room, to this late understanding. I read one of his letters aloud then, my voice steady despite everything it carried, and as the words filled the space between us, I realized that this was the only ending we were ever meant to have, not a return to what once was, but a completion of what had been left unfinished, and when I finished reading, I looked at him and saw not the man I had lost, but the man who had remained in his own way through all the years we had been apart. We did not get the life we might have had, and I did not pretend that we had. But as I sat there beside him, holding the last letter in my hands, I understood something I had not known before, that some loves do not disappear when they are interrupted, they endure quietly, patiently, until the moment they are finally understood.